Thank you for
Great.
coming.
Thank you so much. Is this okay for everybody? Everybody can hear? Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction. So the agenda for today's talk, I'm going to start by giving you a brief introduction to predatory publishing and hopefully dispel some maybe misconceptions we might have about what we mean when we talk about predatory publishing. I'm then going to hand it over to Paige, who's going to talk about some of the tools we have available here at McMaster and some of the strategies you can use to kind of make informed decisions when it comes to picking where you might publish. Then we'll hand it over to Janice, who's going to talk about McMaster's trusted open access journals, as well as how to find journals where we can actually get discounts for publishing in as well, where authors can get discounts. Going to wrap up by talking about some other predatory practices within the current sort of scholarly landscape before we open it up to Q&A and sort of a facilitated discussion. So, what is predatory publishing? And like sort of most simply put, might say that publishing practices that value economic gain over or professional advancement over academic or scientific rigor. So it's where sort of a publisher's bottom line is more important than the actual quality of the research that they're publishing, essentially. And how it works is it tends to leverage article processing charges, often called APCs, that are associated with open access publishing. So for a long, long time, the journal publishing model was a journal put out, they created these journals, they created each issue, and libraries or individuals subscribed to those journals in order to read them. But over the last decade or so, we've seen a real shift away from this subscription-based model to a more open science or open access-based model. And this is due to the fact that we don't want all this valuable research sitting behind paywalls. We want everybody to be able to use it. And often a lot of this research is being funded by taxpayers, so they should be able to read it whether or not they have a subscription, is the general idea. So where APCs come in is the journals needed a way to recoup some of that money they're now losing from subscription fees. So now they charge researchers to publish open access in their journals. It's kind of a flipping of their publication model. So instead of charging subscribers, they charge you at the point of publication. And so this has become sort of a widely accepted way of publishing in the current landscape. But what has happened is that some predatory groups, individuals, publishers have started to leverage these APCs to kind of take advantage of researchers. So they have authors pay these large article processing charges, often thousands of dollars, in exchange for guaranteed publication often, where there's not a proper peer review going through. They're just basically going to say, we'll take it, you just pay us and we'll post it, kind of thing. And predatory publishing really encompasses kind of it's a real wide variety of topic areas. You know, most obviously might be predatory journals and conferences where there is these journals set up specifically meant to try and prey on researchers, essentially, to collect these APCs. Same things with conferences. But then there's also these other sort of more maybe subtle approaches, maybe not so subtle, but different approaches to predatory publishing as well. Things like journal hijacking. This is where instead of creating a brand new journal, they try their best to imitate an existing known journal and have you accidentally submit to their version of that journal instead of another one. For a long time, hijacking's been a concern for smaller journals like from university presses where their websites are pretty easy to mimic. But increasingly, I think with AI and the ability to create really sort of good graphic design quickly, we're actually seeing Elsevier journals, Springer journals start to get hijacked as well. Retraction Watch, which is a great website to keep up to date on what's going on within this sort of area of scholarly communication, maintains a list of journals that have been hijacked, so that can be a helpful resource as well. And the third one that sort of falls into this broad category is journal breaches. These are maybe the most subtle, and they happen over a longer period of time, and it's where the editorial board or the peer review process becomes corrupted over time. So what once was a relatively straightforward journal has over time taken on certain predatory practices or lowered their standard for peer review and these types of things. And I think what's also helpful is clearing up maybe some common misconceptions about predatory publishing. So the first is that all predatory predatory journals are created equal and can be easily identified. And yes, there are certainly those types of journals that are purely meant to try and extract APCs from you. But there are other publishers that are simply neglectful. They're just not doing a great job of managing their peer review process and their editorial policies. And so as a result, they're putting out, they may not even know what they're doing is wrong, but they're putting out content that hasn't really gone through the rigorous process that we expect science to go through, essentially. The second myth I'd like to talk about is that predatory publishers are only going to pose a risk for new or inexperienced researchers. You know, we might have this idea in our head of a predatory publisher, and you may have received emails like this, where it's very clearly some sort of scam going on. The way it's written is all wrong. It's clear that things just don't seem right. You can think of like the dethroned prince email that you just need to pay him $5,000, he'll get back on the throne and send you $1 million, right? So we think that we become pretty adept at spotting these things, but these publishers are becoming increasingly sophisticated. AI, LLMs, they really have opened up the scope of what can be done by a small group of individuals. So researchers at all career stages really must remain vigilant and keep up to date on what's happening in this space. And the final misconception I want to talk about is that publishing in open access journals increases predatory publishing risks. What I don't want you to take away from today's talk is that if I just avoid publishing open access, I won't have to worry about predatory publishing. Open access is here to stay. It's a very important publishing model, and it provides really great benefits to society. And most of today's legitimate journals now offer open publishing options with no added risk. So I don't want you to equate open access to predatory publishing. But just keeping in mind that anytime you're paying to publish something, you want to make sure that where you're publishing is a legitimate source, essentially. Before jumping into some sort of tools and tips for how you can determine whether something may be predatory or not, we can talk briefly about the impacts that it has, both for authors, but also for society as a whole. So obviously, there's a lot of wasted resources if you go and publish in a journal that you don't really want to advertise that you've published in, right? Reduced visibility of your research is another big piece. Most predatory publications aren't going to get indexed in the disciplinary databases that other researchers go to find research. So you may get published, you may put it up on a website, but it's going to be really hard for other researchers in your domain to find if it's not indexed in the core sources that, that your researchers go to. Research and data security issues, if publishers have no problem preying on you for the APC charges, they probably don't really care that much about your data either. So if you're providing things like a username, an email address, a password when you're submitting a journal to a journal, there's nothing stopping them from then selling that data to the highest bidder kind of thing as well. You may lose copyright. So if you publish in a predatory journal, find out afterwards and want to republish that research somewhere else, if you've given away copyright in that first instance, you kind of have no further options. It's just sort of a lost research paper. And obviously there could be potential professional consequences. So if you find out that you've presented at a predatory conference or a predatory published in a predatory journal, you may not want to list that on your CV when you're going up for promotion or a new job or something like that. And so it kind of just leaves this sort of blank spot in your publishing history. For society too, right? Obviously wasted resources. As I mentioned, taxpayers are funding a lot of this research, and if it's not being put in a place where it can be used appropriately, it's sort of lost. As a result, too, we also are seeing increased rates of article retraction where things get into journals that they really shouldn't be in and then have to be pulled out afterwards. And obviously this can lead in general in society to a reduced trust in science or research, something that I think is particularly relevant to the current environment we're living in. So with that, I will now that I've sort of scared you with the boogeyman of predatory publishing, I'll pass it over to Paige, who can talk about some potential approaches to evaluating the journals you think about publishing in.
Okay, thank you. So to help researchers identify and evaluate predatory journals, McMaster Libraries has put together a LibGuide called How to Avoid Predatory Publishers and Conferences that you can find just by Googling McMaster Predatory Publishing or McMaster Predatory Journals. And the LibGuide covers kind of what Jack has already gone over, but it also includes a checklist in like the second item in the menu that I'm going to be going over shortly. And it was adapted from U of T and Queens libraries. And while there's no single characteristic that points to whether or not a publication is legitimate, the checklist covers some of the typical practices used by deceptive publishers. And generally, the higher number of kind of questionable practices, the more you should be concerned. And overall, there are 7 areas to consider. So process and timeline, APCs or article processing charges, the website and contact information, scope and subject matter, indexing and impact, affiliation, and editorial board. And the text is actually so small on the LibGuide that I have transferred everything to some very ugly slides, so I apologize in advance. And I won't read directly off of these, but I'll go over kind of like the main red flags. So for process and timeline, if your article is automatically accepted, that's a red flag. A suspiciously quick turnaround time on the publication, like if they can get it out within a week, has the peer review kind of happen there. If there's no or little information about the peer review process in general, or they try to make you transfer copyright before accepting the manuscript, it should happen after acceptance. For article processing charges, the main one would be they're trying to get you to pay before the article is accepted, obviously. Another one would also be if it's unclear what fees are being charged. So if you've already kind of submitted and they start tacking on a bunch of other like editorial fee that they hadn't already listed on the website, they might just be trying to extract more money from you. For website and contact information, you know, if the journal's name is suspiciously similar to another more well-known journal, or it could be easily mistaken for the more well-known journal. So you can actually easily check this by just going and checking the ISSN, so to see if it's actually the one you think it is or if it's something else, and you can check this on issn.org. Another one is if they can't be easily contacted, or they don't have an address listed, or the email that they want you to use is like a Yahoo or something. It should be like probably an institutional or some kind of professional email address. And the last one here is if the website looks amateurish or unprofessional. There are some caveats to this, but if it just kind of looks thrown together, then that's at least cause for initial concern. For scope and subject matter, the journal should have some kind of well-defined scope. So if the scope seems kind of vague or broad, then that's also a red flag. And like, so say there's a journal on child psychology and they've published something on insect reproduction, that should raise a couple flags there for you. Yeah, I think that's it for that one. For indexing, impact factor, and archiving, if it isn't indexed where it says it is, that's a problem, and you can easily check that by, like, if it says it's indexed in Scopus, you can go and check if it actually is listed there or not, so that's kind of an easy one to, like, check off on the list. They also might use some kind of unknown impact factor, like the universal impact factor, and you can check a journal's metrics on Scopus or journal citation reports. And I have some links later on, and there is also more links listed in the LibGuide online. So affiliation is also pretty straightforward. If they say they're affiliated with like the directory of open access journals, you can go and check to see if they are actually listed on there, or if they don't list any affiliation, that's also kind of weird. So you would want to go see if they are actually listed on like the Directory of Open Access Journals, Committee on Publication Ethics, African Journals Online, stuff like this. And finally is editorial board. So one, you want to make sure that they actually have one, or that it's listed on the website in some capacity. And the other part is kind of difficult. So to see if someone who's actually listed on the editorial board is actually an editor for that journal, sometimes you can find like CVs online or like on websites. Oh yeah.
I just wanted to say that my husband was put on an editorial board without his permission.
Mm-hmm.
His name and his affiliation were all just shoved on some crazy journal that he didn't even know he was part of.
Mm-hmm. That's also happened in like one of the professors in engineering physics had that problem, and someone emailed them because it was like a biology journal or something. They're like, I think you might be listed here like incorrectly, or there's something else going on. So yeah, that's something you also have to check for. Or like, again, if it's a journal on child psychology and you just see people from like wide areas that have nothing to do with child psychology, you kind of hope that your editorial board has some kind of expertise in the topic of the journal. So the next resource that's kind of listed on our LibGuide is Think, Check, Submit, and it's just kind of a simple slogan to help you remember or to help you in your journal selection process. So if you're looking at a journal, you can either think if you already trust the journal or if you need more information. And if you need more information, you can go through the checklist that we've already listed. And then when you're confident that it's not predatory, you can submit your article. And then here are just a couple of the other links, which I'm not sure if this slideshow will be shared afterwards or not, which Sigal said it is, but you can also find these on the LibGuide as well. So next is critical appraisal. And so on top of the LibGuide, you might have heard of some other kind of resources that claim to help researchers identify what's like a predatory journal or not, such as Beall's List or Cable's Predatory Reports. And these so-called blacklists are often fraught with methodological issues and lack of transparency. So the library advocates for the use of the checklist and our LibGuide, and we would urge caution in looking at either of these lists without some kind of critical evaluation. So we'll just go into a little bit more detail. Beall's List was a really popular blacklist that kind of went offline in 2017, but you can still find it floating around in several venues online. And some of the issues that they had were like a lack of transparency of what criteria was used to actually include a journal on the list. The man who ran it also had been accused of having an open access bias, so any open access journals were kind of seen as predatory. And then the list also targeted non-Western journals or like journals that were just underfunded and might not have had like a very nice website at the time that it was evaluated. And Cable's Predatory Reports kind of built upon the death of Beall's and tried to solve some of the more egregious problems like the lack of transparency. So they put together kind of like a list of, or they had a ranking of like predatoriness, but they all have their own problems. So they would list empty journals or journals that didn't actually exist, which kind of raised questions on what's the actual criteria to be included on the list in the first place. They had some dubious criteria like no policies for digital preservation listed in one of like kind of the higher ranking of predatoriness, which people didn't really agree with. And then they had multiple reviewers to go over each journal, but it's unclear how each journal or how each reviewer would actually interpret the different criteria. So there's a criteria that was little geographical diversity of authors, and the journal claims to be international. So that could just be, you know, a lot of people publishing from like Canada and Britain or somewhere. So like it's unclear of how like diverse a journal needed to be considered legitimate or not. Oh, and one problem that's with both of these lists or any kind of list that's going to just tell you what journals are predatory or not is it kind of targets, you don't know how quickly that they're actually updated. So for new journals that are kind of being put out there, they might not have the funding to have like a really fancy website yet. It takes a couple issues to be published to actually get an ISSN. So the information that it's showing you might already be outdated by the time that some of these practices are changed. And I just wanted to go over a couple caveats on the global south or developing nations. Or just any country that kind of has fewer resources or any journal that has fewer resources, which includes newer journals as well. So as I already kind of touched on, a lot of the criteria in both lists unfairly characterize or categorize legitimate journals in the global south as predatory based off standards and expectations that are rooted in kind of well-funded Western institutions. Which may not be fully applicable to journals operating under different conditions, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily predatory. So a couple of the categories that target these journals would be having a really fancy website, spelling mistakes or imperfect grammar. So English is kind of the lingua franca for research, and not every journal has like the budget to be able to afford a copy editor or something like that. And most open access journals that aren't from like a giant publisher are kind of operating on a shoestring budget and volunteer hours anyway. And finally, archival practices. Again, you kind of like for kind of like more accepted archival practices, you're generally paying like another organization to be able to store your copies for you. And this kind of begs the question of whether these journals are actually predatory or deceptive, or just not very well funded in the first place. So I'm now going to pass this off to Janice, who's going to go over some of McMaster's open access support. Oh, you don't need this.
And I'm going to try to use the mic up here and actually go live and away from the PowerPoint. So we'll see what happens. And this may take a second just to flip into a web browser, because I am going to be talking about the library's support for open access and some of the publishing agreements that we have in place that will provide waivers or discounts on APCs. So the URL is in the slide, which should be distributed afterwards, but I am going to just get to where I need to go by Googling library support for open access McMaster. And yes, this is a comment on our website. So with these tabs, library support for open access, and this is a list of about 15 or so publisher agreements that we have in place. So this is not a full overview of all of the publishing opportunities or publishers that are out there. For example, you'll see that the American Psychological Association is not listed. We don't have any kind of agreement with them right now, and we're treating them as a regular subscription publisher. You would need to go to their site if you wanted to publish with them and see what their policies are on depositing an article into an open repository or into MaxSphere, and what kinds of embargoes are in place. But these are agreements with some of the major publishers, such as Elsevier, Sage, Wiley, covering approximately 8,000 journals. Jack started off by talking a little bit about the changes to the publishing model. As a collections librarian who's been working with journals for a long time, I've seen these models change. The library subscribes to many packages, publisher collections of journals. So we tend to see things not in terms of the quality of the individual title and the strength of the editorial board, which are things that you need to consider when you're looking at submitting. But we look at what can we provide across a whole suite of journals. These are mostly read and publish agreements. We don't pay individual APCs, but we have an agreement with the publisher where they will charge us what we had been paying for our subscriptions. But now publishing rights are included, as well as the paywalled access to the content. Many of these are complex arrangements. Sometimes you'll see that only hybrid journals are covered, partially open, partially paywalled. And they also have dates on them, because this is a transitional model, a transformative model. We don't know how it's going to work. The publishers are seeing great revenue streams from the APCs. The libraries want to be able to control our costs, and we don't necessarily know that all of these are going to play out and remain. So if you look very closely, you'll see PLOS. We have an agreement with PLOS, PLOS One, etc. But this is ending as of the end of January this year. So if you're thinking about submitting, get your article accepted very quickly, because otherwise it's going to cost an APC. And there's some question as well whether our Cambridge agreement is going to be renewed or not. You would still be able to publish paywalled in these journals, but as more and more titles move to open access, this is going to be an increasing issue, especially in the sciences. To try to clarify what actually is covered and what isn't, we've subscribed to a service that allows you to search by journal titles to see exactly what's covered. So if I were to enter a search such as evolutionary, if I could type, into the search, it would pop over to something called Sci-Free, which lists the publishers, whether it's fully covered or whether there's only a percentage discount, the copyright options that would be available, and whether the journal is open access, fully open access, or hybrid. So as you're considering places to publish, this list of 8,000 or so journals can be a useful place. Now, because this is a predatory journal colloquium, I would like to emphasize that you can't simply rely on a publisher to be completely safe. And the example on this would be the Hindawi journals that were taken over by Wiley and turned out to be a source of special issues that, shall we say, were not actually produced necessarily by humans, or certainly were not validated. So Wiley, after outcry, responded by shutting down the imprint, stopping 19 of their journals. But during that period before this became a big furor, there was the potential for predatory activity, deception. So this is what I wanted to show for Sci-Free. There's a second resource that Paige mentioned, DOAJ, which is also on the slides, but Sci-Free does not currently include a listing of the DOA journals. So this is just our publishing packages. DOAJ is the broad directory of open journals, vetted. What they try to do is ensure that the journals are active and have some kind of continuing presence, that they're actively publishing a number of articles. Covers worldwide. It's a community that supports this. The library provides some financial support for this. And they do withdraw journals from this directory. So during this year, 2024 so far, they've delisted some 700 journals just because of predatory or inactivity. The search would be mostly by journal title. It doesn't go down to article level subjects, but they do have subjects, broad subjects for the journals. So that's my section. I'm turning it back over to Jack, and he will navigate his way back to the PowerPoint.
Okay, thanks, Janice. Just to wrap us up, open this guy back up. I just want to talk a little bit about some other predatory or deceptive practices that are sort of emerging within this space. Because I think they're good to know about, but they're also kind of interesting. So there's this series of mills listed here: paper mills, review mills, citation mills. And I think when it comes to paper mills, what these basically are, so while we've been talking about up to this point, often from the publisher perspective, how publishers might be taking advantage of researchers, these ones are more from the perspective of how researchers might try and game the system, as it were. So paper mills, what they are, is they are collections of individuals or an individual who are producing what look like good scientific papers, at least on the face of it, and then they solicit authors to pay them to get listed as an author on that publication. So this goes back to this idea of, you know, like I guess like a publish or perish sort of feeling within academia, where there's an urgency to get a lot of publications out there. And so what these paper mills do is they take advantage of that. They're trying to sell authorship on papers. Obviously, things like ChatGPT have made this a lot much more accessible, because you can write a paper in the snap of a finger. And so these are what we're talking about. We talk about paper mills. Review mills are somewhat, they're a little bit different, and they kind of tie into, when we think about the peer review process, it's when the peer review process has been compromised at a journal or at a publisher. So the most sort of maybe well-known cases, the MDPI journals, they found when they looked at the peer review process, an external body looked at the peer review reports on these, they found that there was a huge chunk of the peer review on individual papers that was like identical. Clearly, there was not people systematically going through these articles and peer reviewing them. And on top of that, they almost all were recommending heavily that they cite, that the authors cite specific articles in their journal article. So as an attempt to boost the citations of certain maybe articles in their other journals, also maybe specific authors. This leads us into citation mills, sometimes called citation, I can't, the name is escaping me now. Not cadres, cartels. Citation cartels is the cooler name for them. But basically, it's like it's where there's a group of people and they kind of all collude to go, I'll cite your paper if you cite mine. Or, you know, every time we produce a paper, we're going to put all these citations to our past work in them so that we can boost our citation counts, kind of thing. And then the final piece, false attribution, which you brought up too, right? Where somebody just sticks without you even knowing, you are a sort of a well-respected researcher in your field, somebody just sticks your name on an editorial board or sticks your name on a paper to lend some sort of legitimacy to it. So all these things are things to be aware of as you embark on your career here and continue doing your research. This is just a case study that I've been currently following that I find particularly interesting, because it kind of shows that this is not just a niche little thing. This is happening at the highest levels of universities. The University of Salamanca in Spain. Recently, Springer Nature retracted 75 studies for fraudulent practices, and they were tied to the university rector, who's essentially the president of the university, accused of benefiting from unfair citation activity. And I thought some of these numbers were striking. So across 75 publications, the rector's work was cited over 1,700 times. So it suggests that there was some sort of citation agreement going on potentially between individuals. Also, this one was kind of funny too. The rector himself uploaded a single paragraph to his institutional repository and cited his own work 227 times in it. So, so there's clearly benefits to boosting your publication, boosting your citations, and people are starting to learn how to game the system. So just something to keep in mind, maybe as a word of warning that this is happening, but also just to be aware. I mean, you can follow along. El País has been publishing a lot about this particular case. So that brings us to the end of sort of the formal presentation part, but we're happy to answer any questions you might have. We have some sort of facilitated discussion, but if there's any questions right off the bat. Yeah.
Do you have a sense for legitimate journals? Are they moving towards people paying to publish, or are they sticking to paying to access?
So, and Janice, I don't know if you want to take this?
Sure, I'll take this one. Especially in the sciences and engineering. There's the open access movement, which is encouraging open publication, but also many of the publishers are just discovering that there's gold in them, our gold, and they want to move to an APC-funded model. So yes, I'm seeing an increasing number of journals flipping that way. The model that we prefer is something called subscribe to open, where it's an existing journal, but libraries or institutions agree to continue subscribing even though we don't need to for access in order to continue supporting. And this is often for society journals. There's a third model called Diamond Open Access, where an institute will fund a particular publication or a small number of publications. But whether that's sustainable or not, we don't know. So yes, it's definitely changing.
Yeah, and kind of ironic based on what we just said, but a lot of these kind of journals that are going open access from bigger publishers are charging an APC and then not really telling you how they've come up with that number. So let's kind of stick like a $5,000 price tag on it, and like that's how much it costs to publish this, and then we won't release any more information. So it's highly kind of subjective, and they're kind of able to just increase that over time based off of like prestige factor.
Publishing has actually gotten cheaper, not more expensive over time, I think. Because like the physicality of having
Right.
a press is gone.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how can they get away with this? And do you think that there'll be someone stopping this?
It'd be nice. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. There's a real inherent tension, I think, behind what open science is trying to accomplish, in that it's trying to open up research as much as possible, and what publishers, which have a capitalistic, like they are for-profit companies, have in mind when it comes to openness, which is how can we make as much money off of this as possible. I don't know how we combat it. They seem to keep shifting their models and changing to kind of keep you chasing maybe a solution, but I don't have any good answer.
You can go first, Janice.
I will say that I don't think it's the libraries that are going to be able to do this, that I think it has to be coming from the academy. And I know there's lots of conversation about this, but it's a sticky problem. You probably remember things like the Elsevier boycott, and that sort of faded away. And now Elsevier is one of the biggest, they're opening their journals for a fee. So it's not, what we keep saying is if only we could change the promotion and tenure system so that it isn't the number of citations that is solely determining impact. And it's not the number of publications, it's the 3 best articles. But that's changing the whole academy system, so.
Yeah, and like as collections librarians, Janice and I, part of our job is to like meet with these publishers and talk about like, because we license their content, and we kind of ask them like, what is this number that you're giving us kind of based off of? And just to kind of directly answer your question, they're saying that the prices haven't really changed that much, like the costs on their end, because they have to pay to digitally archive things, so that takes up a bunch of money. Inflation, I guess, is what they've also been giving us, but it's kind of, they give us, for lack of a better term, kind of like half-assed answers on kind of where their money's actually going, and there's no transparency across like a lot of them. So librarians are trying to kind of piece together information that we can within our legal boundaries, but yeah.
Yeah, and if you guys have a chance to publish in a society journal, you should try to do that, because at least the money goes back to the society. It pays for student travel fees or grants to conferences and things like that. But people have different ideas about what's important when they're publishing.
So do I understand correctly that you would recommend doing the subscription
Yeah, so when Janice mentioned before, like, we prefer subscribe to open, when it is kind of like a full open access model. But what you're talking about, we call it like green open access, putting the preprint in like an institutional repository of some kind, or I don't know if there's like bioarchive where you can put things online. I don't know if there's like a similar one for psych.
Well, I guess I'm confused, so in the subscribe to open, the public would not be able to access it, right?
No, they can. So for sub.
Some years or something.
So for subscribe to open, instead of just paying to allow people to like publish, we just continue paying the subscription fee, but they use that money to open up to everyone. So it's kind of like McMaster Libraries or McMaster University, and then a bunch of other universities are basically funding them to allow anyone to access the research, because it's kind of already paid for by taxpayers, so we believe it should be open to everyone.
So just the journals and reviews.
Depends on if publishers are willing to make a deal in the first place, or even choose the subscribe to open model, because we can't kind of choose what model they go for, but when there is a subscribe to open model, that's what we prefer to kind of fund.
That is a really, really good question, though, because that's the dilemma that a lot of authors are facing, especially if they don't have grant funding to support immediate open access publishing. So that would be the case with publishing in the American Psychological Association journals right now, that you would be able to put your preprint in PsychArchive, and it would be paywalled. The version of record would be paywalled. But it's your call on whether that's good enough for what you need, and whether the distribution of the ideas through the preprint is actually serving society's goals. So,
Yeah, I think it's really hard, because even if you do have all the money,
yeah.
is it money well spent when I could top up a graduate student with that 3,000, right? Like, in many ways, I'd rather put money elsewhere.
Exactly, exactly.
But if you have standard, how much money for the creditor? You can say you will offer higher price. You have
Well, I don't think there's any real distinction between the prices that predatory journals pay versus traditional journals. They'll run the gamut, and you could see a predatory journal offer a low price to make it seem like, oh, this is the deal of the century. But generally, you're seeing in the range of hundreds of dollars to anywhere up to like $10,000 for. That's the highest I've seen, but I don't know.
Yeah, 10,000 would be for publication in Nature,
Right.
but generally 2,500 US, 3,000 US, might be less for different types of articles, 800 for. So, but yes, you're right in that the predatory journals may offer what seems to be a slightly lower rate to entice you.
And something, sorry, just to go back to what you said up there about the green OA, or like putting it in some kind of archive instead, you want to make sure that whoever you're publishing with actually allows you to do that, even if you're getting grant funding, because like you said, you might want to put that money elsewhere. But the tri-agency funding, so SSHRC and NSERC, are putting together different open access guidelines. So if you get money from them, you're going to have to follow through with their different stipulations. So one of those stipulations is if you're getting a grant from them because it's funded by taxpayers, you need to be able to make that open access. So I'm not sure if they follow up on that or not. But you want to make sure that if you're not going to, like if you don't want to put that money towards publishing open access, that you have the rights to be able to put it into like your preprint copy into an archive to be able to fulfill whatever guidelines they end up coming out with at the start of 2026, maybe? Something like that. But yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, you just kind of touched on it with SSHRC and NSERC, right? Is there a role that government should be playing in all this? Or is playing or should be playing that they don't
So to the extent that I know, their involvement has been at the funding level and saying in order to get funding, you have to make your article open within, I think, there's a period, 12 months, within a year. Beyond that, they're kind of like, then you guys figure it out how you want to do it, publishers. We don't want to interfere. That's probably where you could have maybe some actual good conversations about what the price of publishing actually is these days, is at that government level where you could maybe regulate a little bit more. But to my understanding, they're kind of hands off. Once they say you have to publish it open, how it gets open, we don't want to know.
Right. I'm thinking like, are there laws against certain types of predatory practices that they could put into place so that they could take regulatory action against some of these journals? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's a good idea, making.
Well,
laws,
what's tricky, I think, and Paige, Janice, I'm interested to hear your thoughts as well, but what I think what's tricky is like, we have these predatory journals, we think in mind, we think like, it's this clear scam, and it's just purely meant to bilk you out of your money. But there's this whole big messy middle of like, what is good editorial practice? Is peer review going on well at these journals? That I think it would be hard in that messy middle to really, it's a whole other thing to define what good practice is, if that makes sense.
I'll give you an example. We were asked to submit an article to a Frontiers journal. And that Frontiers journal was a special issue, and I knew the editor, someone I really respect, and she asked us to submit a paper to this special issue. And it seemed perfect. It just seemed like the perfect issue for what we wanted to do. So we went ahead. And then I saw these guys speaking, and everyone in the audience was like, don't publish in a Frontiers journal. They're all predatory. You're crazy. That's a bad journal. And I went back and I talked to Jane, the editor, and I talked to, I mean, we're not paying for it, first of all. Like I said, we are not paying to publish in your special issue. But if you want our paper, we have a perfect paper for this issue. So they waived the fees, and we are publishing it there. But I trust her to get us good reviews, and we've had good reviews from them. So I don't know. I don't know what to do. Like, it was like just the perfect place, and I went with the Predatory Journal. Even
Yeah.
though all my colleagues told me not to.
And there's also like, again, something to mention with that is like there's variation within like a publisher too.
Are journals really predatory? Yes.
Mm.
No. Maybe.
It depends on your take on it if you want to put your research there. So like some of the Frontiers Journal, I think immunology and psychology in particular, we get quite a few publications from McMaster there. It depends on who the editorial board is, but I know they've had like questionable editorial decisions in the past where they've removed editorial boards, and the editorial boards were saying that it's because the rejection rate was too high. Then there's like that famous rat picture that got out where it was just like wildly inaccurate rat anatomy with like gibberish everywhere. They were kind of like, so you didn't look at this picture before you published like this rat with like, I don't want to get into it, but but yeah, so it kind of varies. And like even with the MDPI articles, which general consensus would be predatory, for very niche areas, sometimes there's not a whole lot of journals that are available. So like mycology, there's not a whole lot of mycology journals or like fungi and mushroom studies. So that might be seen as like a fine venue because you know the editors and there's just like a limited amount. So it's still, it depends. It's not a great answer, but.
It's also a little bit tricky because sometimes there's relationships with, for example, Frontiers or with MDPI, where McMaster faculty are doing editorial work. So, and then their own publications fees are being waived. So are they contributing to a predatory?
Practice.
Exactly.
Community. Maybe.
Ex-
Maybe I should have asked those questions. I did not.
But you had a personal relationship. You knew the people. And that's actually one of the most important things in publishing, is the relationships with the board, with the scholars. But you're seeing exactly how difficult this is.
Has anyone else published in Frontiers?
And it was one of the first open access journals. I personally know the individuals that started PLOS, as well as people at Frontiers, and I know what they are trying to do. And it was, break apart Elsevier's stranglehold on academic publishing. I looked up, while we were sitting here, I thought, oh, I haven't looked at Elsevier's stock prices. It's gone up in the last 5 years, fivefold.
They really benefited from COVID.
Yeah, it's big money.
This was a person that I have published in the MDPI that I think is even worse than Frontiers because same situation, a special issue. The editor was from the academic family also, so they asked us for doing that. And one thing, I don't like the system of MDPI to having something published in a week or a month maximum, but something that I really enjoy when I saw is just all of the reviews were open for many years ago. So that's something that some journals are incorporating now. And surprisingly, there in the MDPI that you can see that the reviews sometimes are like very, very brief, like almost lacking. But they are open, completely open. And I think the reviews are part of we, especially the student and the people that are starting, learn a lot about the process, how was all the process. And that was something also surprising for me for MDPI. That was there all the time publishing the reviews completely open. So that's something that
This is the first time I've ever published in Frontiers. What I don't like about it is that the review process can go on and on and on and on. And it seems like there's never a stop, and it doesn't have you don't have a day where you get your reviews and all your reviews are there. You can have the third referee send it in 2 weeks after the second referee, and I just don't like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel efficient.
But I think your point is a really good one in that, I think it's awareness of, there's no easy answers here. There's a lot of shades of gray, and your best judgment is what you need to be armed with when you're approaching publishing. And just simply being aware of the landscape allows you to see things that that makes sense that the peer review process should be more, you should be able to go back and look at how things have been done previously. And so that we can advocate as a whole for these types of changes at the journal and publisher level. So what I don't want you to take away is that, oh, there's a yes and a no. It's very much shades of gray. I think having sat through this session, you've at least been introduced to the concepts that are important behind these things. And so I think you can go into your next sort of publishing opportunity with a bit more of a critical eye maybe, and thinking about, does this check the boxes that I'm looking for it to check in order for me to feel comfortable putting my research in this space? Yeah.
If we're in the phase of just getting to ask you all the random questions, I'm trying to find that I can't anymore, but there's always some, I think it was an academic from Montreal who did his own sort of analysis on the journals, or the major publishers and all their journals. And I'm wondering, so now I can't find it, I'm sorry, but it was something like, okay, Springer Nature, of course we would also, okay, Nature, but they're adding all these journals to their portfolio and kind of becoming predatory in that sense. I'm wondering if you could, what you probably know this world much better than I can say what happened. Could you speak about that?
So there's a couple of things that are happening. There's Elsevier was doing kind of mirror journals where they would have a journal, well known, and then they would have the open access version of the journal, and they'd just add an X to the end of the journal title, but it was really kind of the same journal so that they can just publish. This is a little bit of a digression too, but one thing that we're noticing with the library agreements that we're trying to track is that with Elsevier, we have publication in their hybrid journals is covered by our publishing agreement. But sometimes they are rejecting the submission and saying, but here, we will accept it in this fully gold journal that we also publish, and here's the APC cost. So we're trying to track that. It's hard because we don't necessarily know this is happening. With Springer, there is a proliferation of journals. They've always had, not Nature, but the Springer portfolio, a bit of a reputation of having a padded list of some very low-quality journals along with their high-quality journals. I can't say if they're continuing to increase the number of journals, but I know that as we look at their whole portfolio, which we subscribe to this as a package, so we have all of their titles. It's hard for us to evaluate this because we don't really want to, we can't look at it as a value per title because 2,500 journals, it would seem like very low value, whereas we really continue to have all of these journals just to get the ones that are valuable.
No, I wish I might have been a marker somehow of becoming what that is right now. Okay, they say they've had like a 40% increase in journals in the portfolio as a way to just bring in more money.
That could be happening. I'm not sure. I know that they are trying to do a public offering, and so that they're very much conscious of trying to raise money right now. The business.
I guess I think that there's a lot of students in the audience. I look around, I see postdocs and students, and I'm wondering like what the PIs in the audience would say to these students and postdocs about how to approach choosing a journal to publish in, and what do you do with your students or your trainees about this? Because like it is bamboozling, right? There's like 7,000 journals, 1,000 psychology journals. How do you choose? What do you do? So I can tell you what I do, and then I'd really like to hear like what Laurel does, or Nick does, or Jin does, or Kathy does. I tend to tell my students the journals I think that they should be publishing in, and then we read the scopes and aims of maybe 3 or 4 journals together, and we make a decision based on those scopes and aims, where they fit. And I have to admit that publishing fees play a big role. You know, I always want to aim as high as possible, but I really don't want to pay. I really, really don't want to pay to publish. So I try to find journals that don't do that, and I'm lucky because in behavioral ecology, there's still a ton of society journals that are really good, and I can get my stuff published without paying. But not in Nature, not in Science, and I would definitely pay that if I had a paper that got accepted there, because it's such a big win for you scientifically and professionally to have a journal in one of those great, great journals. What do other people do? Nick, what do you do? Jim, what do you do?
There's just few journals I always submit. That's safest, right?
You just stay safe.
You know, I prefer to go to PubMed. If pop the engine, pop all the journal, the title pop out, so choose the bigger one. So this one not accepted to go to lower or lower. So the go to public engine to pop out all the journals. Yeah, that make it safe way. Yeah, so I don't think a particular journal will leave the upper top one.
What do you do, Mel?
Well, in the brainstorming stage, we just open up our own reference section. We look at what journals are in our own reference section, see where's a good fit, and then we'll look at the scopes of the journal.
Is that what you guys do too?
Yeah, I guess we do a lot of things and it's like evolving over the years and getting more and more difficult. Yeah, I mean, we obviously aim high, so we'll start there with a very reputable one. I really resent paying the fees, but more, I guess that's the trend in my lab is that more and more pay them. I used to feel like, okay, it didn't matter if, you know, it's a year or two before it becomes publicly accessible. Now it seems like things are moving faster and I have more students that are more publicly accessible. 4 years, so it's my life anymore. A lot more than that.
So what Laurel's talking about is that a lot of journals will have a paywall for a year, and then Yeah, I know the same.
open access. Until, I don't know, a couple of years ago, then I started getting all the emails that we take it down. But before that, you know, the journals were not predatory the way they are now, but they didn't track it. Like, so, they seemed okay if you just wanted to send your paper around. Nobody policed it. But now they're getting so into wanting every dollar. And, you can't easily do that. So now you can put preprints out, and so we do that a lot. But they are harder to find. And then the other thing is if you put a preprint out and that's the copy that somebody finds, then they have to actually check it if it ever got published. Right? And it makes a difference if something got published.
And I'm sometimes worried that there's predatory practices out there where people go to these archives, where people just put their preprint that hasn't been accepted and try to publish it as their own. I've heard that that can happen. I don't know if that's true. Have you guys heard about that?
I haven't heard anything about that yet, but
Uh-oh, Nick has an example.
No, I'm just going to vent to be controversial here, but I'm really, really sick of reviewing and getting, like, you're asked to review a paper and then you have, it's got to be 2 weeks turnaround and you're getting emails, auto-generated emails and things, and you're working for free for a journal that's going to turn around and charge you $6,000 or $7,000 to publish it. So that's my vent. But, yeah, the system has a lot, like, I want to start a journal. It's money printing. And basically exploits scientists who like to work for free for reasons I never totally understood. That's my bad.
But no, that's a great point, that maybe we should agree to referee if it grants us the ability to get a paper into that journal in the future for a lower fee or no fee or something like that. Kathy, you had something to say.
So in my field, I've always paid page turns, always. So forget about open access. I don't pay on top because I can't afford to pay another $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 on top of already paying $2,000 in page charges. So in my area, that's been standard. When you folks all start talking about these free journals, I'm like, they don't exist in my field.
Are there any student questions about all of these publishing practices and journals and how to choose one?
Do you have any suggestions for grad students for that case? Like if there's like a lot of like controversy around like publication and what's best, do you have any suggestions? Because like grad students usually don't publish in like Nature, you know, but like what are the suggestions in that case? Do you have any?
oh,
No page. I think following visiting some of the resources that we pointed out here today can be a helpful starting point to kind of orient you to what's out there. So DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, might be a great place to sort of get the lay of the land as far as open access journals are concerned. And Sci-Free,
Yeah.
of course, because Sci-Free is going to tell you if you're actually going to get a discount for public, because maybe you don't even have to pay, right?
And then I would also say, like, talk to your like supervisor, but also talk to other people in the department, because I've also heard before students who didn't want to publish where their direct supervisor wanted them to, and just felt like they didn't really have a say in the matter and didn't know how to like approach it. So maybe like if that's your case or like you're worried about that, have like a couple people on standby so that if they did say, oh, I want you to publish here, you're like, oh, well, this person say I should do this one. What do you think about that? So that would be kind of my other suggestion in addition to looking at the ones that are covered by Sci-Free.
And I would also add, as a student, do not pay an APC out of pocket, because I have heard of students doing this. It is not a worthwhile investment in your future career. Like, it's just not worth the money. So find another avenue to publish.
Oh my God. Seriously?
$3,000 on a graduate student's budget, I mean, I'm sorry, there's other possibilities.
Yeah,
Just
look at
do it paywall, just find another journal, talk to your Yeah.
Or like publish subscription and then put it in a preprint or several preprints, like preprint archive kind of things.
And here I wanted to ask, what I usually do is just I post all my papers, subscription and open access in ResearchGate, and the subscription I upload it there in private version, but the people that really want to read the paper, the people that want to go beyond the abstract, that we don't have time to read too many papers, but when people really want to read the paper, they ask you and you just deliver through a message to them. So that's my way of dealing. And yeah, recently I realized how important are preprints in those situations. But I realized that people sometimes don't want to read a preprint or because it's not so fluent the way we submit the preprints to the site archive or the bioarchive are in a layout that are not very pretty. And I think that journals sometimes what they give us is basically the editing part apart from the peer review. But once it's peer review, the only thing that they are adding is just the editing part. And sometimes we are the best people editing our own work, just the layout, because sometimes they have like machines that they produce. They sometimes just change our statistics. They commit many things that we need to amend during the process. So I'm investing a little bit of time in like having a pretty layout, and people are like saying, Rafa, we know that it's taking more time for you to having the preprint pretty, but you are like giving us like the product there open and we can access it. So I don't know because I'm aware that like archive and all the OSF repositories are gonna sometimes at some point they're gonna be very loaded. This is the overwhelming amount of information that they are storing now. I think there's gonna be a limit for them. So I'm wondering if the repositories of the university they are like investing in that, in having like a university repository or a template preprint from the university. I think that would be wonderful, like facilitating that for researchers. That would encourage many people to use the template of the university and having a beautiful preprint or having just like their own repository of the university. I think that could be amazing.
Yeah, so we do have our own repository called MaxSphere here. It's currently undergoing a bit of a facelift, let's call it. And it should be, we should see the new version early next year, early 2025. And you'll probably see an increased push for introduction to MaxSphere as an institutional repository. I do like your idea though of a template for preprint articles to just give them a little bit more flair than just a flat Word document kind of thing.
And Jonathan Cannon shared with me that when he was not motivated anymore to write papers, the thing he does to motivate himself is he kind of makes it look like a real paper. And then all of a sudden he likes his paper more and he starts working on it more. So he said that was one of his motivation tricks, to put it in a kind of, like, to make it look like a real article.
Yeah.
So we should do that, so all these people will get super productive. I think we should probably call it a day, but thank you guys so much for interesting